I thank the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Roberto Bissio, Executive Director of the Third World Institute. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Acting President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce, Excellencies. I have to admit that when I first received the invitation for this session, I thought somebody sent the wrong form. I should be there tomorrow in the meeting with civil society. But then I understood the idea of having civil society also address the business meeting and having business tomorrow address the civil society meeting, which I think it's a very healthy, a very good idea. So I accepted the challenge and started to prepare my remarks. And as you usually do when you don't know very much about the subject, you start to look for the definition. And the best definition I found was from Peter Drucker, who most of you know, a guy who wrote probably more than 50 books about management, about business through a life of almost 100 years. And he provided the shortest definition. Business, he said, that's easily defined. It's other people's money. And okay, that made me feel better because civil society organizations, we are not for profit, but we are always asking other people for their money, including from the business sector. So we know a little about that. And coming to think of it, the governments are also about other people's money, only they call it taxes. So the UN is bringing together in these days governments, business, and civil society to discuss precisely about other people's money, but to discuss it on how to put it in the context of sustainable development. And that's the key and very important challenge. Now, business is a key actor in sustainable development, but not all business have the same role. A recent World Bank study concluded, for example, that small firms employ a large share of workers and create most jobs in developing economies. And in all countries, countries that have had net job losses in the economy as a whole, and we can think of several, it is only the small firms that have net job gains. Now, this is a concept that my neighborhood baker explained very clearly to me not long ago. He said, if I fire my brother-in-law, I will still have to contribute to the education of my nieces. So small business people care more about the community and about the environment because the community and the environment in which small and medium enterprises operate is the same one in which the small and medium business persons, men and women, live and raise their children. But in spite of those many documented advantages of small and medium enterprises, the rules of the global economy, or the lack of rules, favor concentration. Out of the largest 100 economies in the world, 51 are corporations. The top 200 corporations' combined sales annually are bigger than the combined economies of all countries except 9. That is, they surpass the combined economy of 182 countries, 200 corporations. This is a result and a cause of enormous inequalities within and among countries that the SDGs precisely attempt to correct. In 2013, Margaret Chan, the Director General of the World Health Organization, delivered a remarkable speech in which she stated, and I quote, "Efforts to prevent non-communicable diseases go against the business interest of powerful economic operators. In my view, this is one of the biggest challenges facing health promotion. It is not just big tobacco anymore. Public health must also contend with big food, big soda, big alcohol. All these industries fear regulation, protect themselves using the same tactics. Market power readily translates into political power, and few governments prioritize health over big business." And I end the quote. The benefits that we expect from the market derive from competition, as you all know. For the game to be fair, we need a level playing field, and we need rules that apply equally to all. Now, this is why, for example, we expect Addis Ababa conference to address the issue of the unfair impact over competition of bilateral investment treaties that give big corporations access to investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, allowing them to sue government as special arbitration panels, while small and medium enterprises only have their local justice to defend them in the national courts. This system has resulted in has been abused so much that it's high time to revise it. There is a complex network of over 3,000 bilateral and plurilateral investment agreements. And that web can only be disentangled through an investment framework negotiated at the UN. Why? Because the UN is where human rights have their home. Second, domestic companies have to pay their taxes, and they often do. But corporations use tax evasion and tax avoidance schemes, as we read daily in the news. Strengthened international tax cooperation is in the interest not just of small and medium enterprises, it might even help some big corporations repair a very tarnished image. Many people still think that finances for development is about aid, or official development assistance, ODA, as it is officially called. But it isn't, or it isn't only about ODA. High-level panel chaired by former South African President Mbeki demonstrated, and recently published its report, that $50 billion flow out of Africa illegally every year. This is double the total ODA received by Africa. Now, when you think of illicit finances coming out of Africa, you probably think of blood diamonds, arms trade, and criminal activities. Now, the Mbeki panel found out that 60% of that illegal evasion comes from recognized, established, and reputable corporations. And that is not counting tax exemptions, which favor them on top of that. So tax cooperation and avoiding the race to the bottom is the best value for money that you can get today. Domestic resources is very high in the agenda of Addis Ababa, but expanding the tax base in developing countries without having ensured international tax cooperation before can only mean more taxes on consumption, which is not good for business, and on small and medium enterprises themselves, and particularly the micro-entrepreneurs of the informal sector, a majority of which are women. Now, at Social Watch, we are very much in favor of formalization of micro-entrepreneurs, of domestic workers, of rural workers, and there are examples where that works, so that they can get social protection and benefits, so on, but it shouldn't be so that they pay an even higher share of the tax base because the big contributors are just completely absent. I am sure that partnerships will be discussed today and tomorrow. The multi-stakeholder partnerships have a potential benefit beyond the traditional concepts of philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. It is argued that bringing corporations in the implementation of the new development agenda will reduce the participation gap in international politics, and in doing so will contribute to the democratization of global governance. Yes, but there is a risk. Existing partnerships between international organizations and individual companies are generally exclusive, and this collaboration can disadvantage the competitors of the firms participating in the partnerships, very frequently the small and medium domestic enterprises. This sort of partnerships provide corporations with an image advantage by wrapping them with the UN flag and opening up markets for them that they might not be able to access because they were privileged for domestic firms in case of procurements, for example, and we know cases where this have happened. Even more dangerous, so-called PPPs, private-public partnerships, are being promoted as the major channel for business involvement in the new agenda, particularly, but not exclusively, in infrastructure. Now, the OECD defines PPPs as a form of government procurement. It's a peculiar form of procurement because it is usually shrouded in secrecy, not open to bidding, and in a way, it accepts a buy now, pay later formula. So it adds up like giving a teenager their parents' credit card. It is not surprising that PPPs have led, including in many OECD member countries, to irresponsible spending and creating indebtedness much beyond what had been authorized because it excludes the budget process. As a result of the combination of secrecy and lack of bidding and competition, very, very frequently PPPs end up in corruption accusation. Again, read the newspapers of the day. The UN should think twice or three times before putting its reputation at stake, associating itself with these formulas. The UN has started already a process to come out with a legally binding instrument on the human rights obligations of corporations. Now, I know that the business sector doesn't like the terms legally binding in this framework, but again, it is all about the rules of the game. Would we like to watch a football game or cricket or baseball or whatever if the rules were voluntary and applied depending on the mood of the referee? No. Good competition requires legally binding rules that all participants can beforehand know. That creates predictability. So it's good for small and medium enterprises, but it's good for the economies and business in general, and we hope that business welcomes this process and actively participates in it. Mr. Chairman, Peter Drucker also famously said that management by objectives work if we know the objectives. Now, his punchline was 90% of the time, managers do not know the objectives. Luckily, this is not the case here. We know the objectives. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, 169 targets. That's what our management should deliver. Now, some have argued that this more than doubles the number of the goals in the Millennium Development Goals that were just 8, but the comparison is quite unfair. The MDGs were essentially about reducing poverty in the poorest of countries. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are universal. They apply to all countries. They aim at eradicating poverty everywhere and at the same time reducing inequalities, achieving gender justice, ensuring universal social protection, access to essential services, water, sanitation, power, education, and health, and at the same time respecting the planetary boundaries. This is achievable. It is an ambitious but achievable agenda, but it requires fundamental changes in the prevailing unsustainable consumption and production patterns. Ultimately, it requires a change of paradigms, including on how we do business. Thank you very much.